question has two parts, really. What are the threats or the challenges for us? But the other part is, what are the opportunities? And both of them are interesting. Harry Truman once said that we have only two vital interests. One is survival, and the other is prosperity. And so anything linked with survival and prosperity ought to be of a high order of interest to the United States. And so the Soviets, or in their nuclear posture, threatened us. Russia still does in some ways, as we threaten them. And so whether mutually assured destruction or a better paradigm will work is certainly out there. And some people, including yours truly, have looked at zero nuclear weapons as a real possibility, despite the fact that it'll be very hard to get there. But four very distinguished individuals, George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn, said we ought to give it a serious look, and I think we should. I think that on the prosperity side, anything that affects the economic stability of the world affects ours. And so really in a kind of butterfly incident, home mortgages in the United States set off an economic collapse in the international community. It wasn't quite complete, but it was pretty thorough. And so we need to look in many ways at our economic stability as a very important part of how the world proceeds and vice versa. And we have opportunities to strengthen that. I think through stronger international cooperation, through better monitoring of what people are doing economically, and through the building into the international economic system of incentives for good behavior rather than rewards for bad behavior, if I could put it that way. And I think that that's important. That's vague, but I think there are things that can be helpful. Things that say if you make your money honestly, and in fact, if you are part of an international community in which you live and work, you will be rewarded. And if you make your money dishonestly, you'll go to jail. And I think those are important, simple questions that need to be looked at. I think the third piece is very interesting. We do well as a country, and our leadership is very significant, and it has been for a long time, partly because we're very strong, both in military terms, but economically. The third piece to that, I think, is very significant, that we have values and principles which the rest of the world looks up to. And in some ways, our recovery, if I could call it that, from the downturn in popularity that came with Iraq in the main, and possibly Afghanistan, mistreatment of detainees and a whole lot of things, is now perhaps turning around because we have an effort to move back to using our original values and principles, things in the Declaration of Independence, things in the Constitution, things in American judicial practice over the years that have characterized us as a state that has moral values, that looks after people's interests, that works hard to try to do the right thing, that thinks fairness, equity, and justice are important for the rest of the world, and that we would live by them. And our coming out of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, and we haven't come out all the way yet, are important contributions to that part of what I would call, in the Joe Nye terms, either our soft power or smart power attraction in the rest of the world. We're not going to die out in leadership. We'll have our ups and downs like everybody else. But I think it's important that we understand what are the underpinnings of that and how we can translate those into very useful things. I think international stability, dealing with terrorism, dealing with obviously cyber problems are also very important for the future. It's an issue that I would characterize by a basket of connected problems. And the three words that would describe the issue best, I think, are poverty, growth, and development. And you might look at words like food, health, and water as part of the antidotes or some of the beginnings of trying to help people who are in the poverty trap to move ahead. But the issue combines many other things: failed and failing states, narcotics trafficking, terror, migration, trade perturbances, international health problems fit in their own way. And so this is, put it this way, a seriously interconnected set or web of challenges that are out there where a combination of science, organization, and international collaboration can play a better role. And we and others over the years have been afflicted at finding single bullet solutions, single silver bullet solutions. I think it is in a combination of solutions that things work better. And things like education, global health support are fundamental to dealing with this set of problems. But so is good governance, and so is an absence of corruption. And these are really big global questions because they affect billions of people in the planet and have to be looked at from that point of view, even though they may not directly threaten our survival and our prosperity. In many ways, they have a big impact. I have two or three things to say about that. I think that the unrecognized value of the United Nations system for Americans is not the small successes and small failures, if I can put it that way, in the area of threats to peace and security in the Security Council, as important as that is, and I wouldn't demean that. But I would say it's the things that make everyday events and activities work. Civil aviation, maritime cooperation, meteorology, banking and finance, cooperation and development, a special vocation for helping children around the world, and we can go on and on. Making the postal systems work internationally, making telecommunications function internationally, having the internet have a stable base in the coordination of frequencies for wireless and for all of those things. And interesting enough, that's the specialized agencies of the United Nations. They started before the UN. They were amalgamated first into the League and then into the UN system. They don't cooperate together as much as they could, and they all have their difficulties and challenges, the World Health Organization in the Ebola crisis, for example. But we should work to fix that and to make that better and to find a way to bring greater coherence across the board. And various secretaries general of the UN have sat them down and said, let's coordinate our budget activities. Let's work together in moving this. Each of these organizations has their own, put it this way, constituency, their own assembly, their own parliament, in effect, and their own leadership. But they still are part of a globalized world. And even organizations like the Bank and Fund, which we do not normally think of being UN organizations, have a UN association, certainly in their birth, if not in their continued life. People have fed the American public essentially on the black helicopter stealing lawn furniture type stories that we all know is a hyperbolic explanation for people's concern that the UN will be some kind of monster controlling authority with men from Mars coming into the world to run the world as a kind of a blatant authoritarian dictatorship, not in the interest of the United States. And of course the UN is not really anything like that. The UN is the member states. The member states are, interestingly, us. We helped to design it. It was very much seen as part of our own political policy future. It has been in large measure a servant of the American foreign policy interest, not an opposition. And in many measures, it's an essential part of what we look at. But it's not the only organization. And you're quite right that things like NATO, things like standalone organizations in various other parts of the world, peacekeeping in the Arab-Israeli context, kinds of efforts that involve the whole humanitarian complex of non-governmental organizations all feed into this, and sometimes are worked with IGOs, sometimes with NGOs. But certainly the Arab League or the Organization of the Islamic Conference are stepping a little more up to the plate now to be responsible and helpful in making things work. We've overplayed the veto. That's not a popular role. But my view is that the veto works best when a state has to use it to defend effects on its own territory or its own close allies that affect its vital interest. Otherwise, I think the veto is an enormously valuable tool in negotiating UN resolutions. But it's even more valuable, in effect, if we have among the permanent members either a consensus or we can build a consensus. And the fact that the U.S., Britain, and France have in the past often stood together has helped to bring along Russia and China. But there are times when we've also agreed with Russia. They're not so many,
Right.
but they're not so few. And this has made the Security Council an effective operation. But the Security Council has a sixth veto in it, and that's the unity of the non-aligned members, who generally are enough there to block a successful vote. And we have to take that into consideration. I'd love to see the permanent members decide that, you know, unless 3 of them were going to oppose a resolution, say on a subject as salient as important as stopping genocide, and the full effect of that would, I think, help to make that a better resolution, if I can put it that way, we ought to adopt a voting convention like that. Now, that isn't going to happen. I thought maybe the end of the Cold War it might, but it's something like that. The French are now asking everybody not to exercise the veto in the cases of UN consideration of the Security Council of Genocide. That's a little more extreme, but it's balanced. I don't think it will work. It doesn't require changing the charter, but that's important. The second question, the UN, is how we select the Secretary General. Look, it's time for a woman. That's over and above the process. But at the same time, the process is now still regionally based. It is somebody's turn, this time Eastern Europe. Well, Eastern Europe's okay. Eastern Europe used to be essentially the Warsaw Pact. Now it is essentially mostly NATO, but it's split. And I don't mind if they have a turn, but we've been through almost everybody else. It's time to quit the notion, have it broadly. I would ideally like to see the Security Council, which has to do the nomination, appoint a group of former presidents and heads of state, really respectable, responsible people from all around the world, and ask them to put their best list together of candidates who might well fit the bill. Not people who are kind of dumbed down because they meet the lowest common denominator, but what I would call it spruced up by the fact that they have this very distinguished panel of former heads of state saying, yes, these are the kind of people we should choose. Some have suggested that it's time for the Security Council to provide the General Assembly with a choice rather than one candidate. And maybe that will work. On the other hand, it would shock the Security Council if the General Assembly basically said, no, we don't like your choice. Go give us another one. Well, you know, and so something in the choice, in my view, is also the responsibility of the membership. I think finally people have talked about a broader membership of the Security Council. Well, we all know that there's a veto lurking behind every broadening effort, almost, not quite, but there's opposition. My sense is that the halfway house is that these new putative members, the Indias, the Brazils, the Japans, will be serving more often as non-permanent members. It's a halfway house. But it elbows aside a number of other countries who really might want to serve if they, in fact, have most of the time taken up by the bigger states in their regions, because each region has a rota of service that each state can have. But I think those are important. We shouldn't go around, I think, talking about a hierarchy of these or who runs what. Our role is, I think, to lead, but to lead with groups, to be part of coalitions of effort. A great leader is always a little bit out in front, but has plenty of people behind coming along to work with him. In that sense, I think maybe over the last couple of decades, we got kind of caught up in the notion that with the end of the Cold War, everything fell like a ripe plum into our laps, and we could decide to do whatever we wanted to do. We didn't really have to consult with anyone. We just tell them what we're going to do and tell them they should come along. It was in their best interest to do so. And that kind of diplomacy, you and I know from experience, doesn't work. It is sharing ideas, getting them to tell us what's on their mind and what they would like to do, and then helping to shape our best ideas into being their best ideas is what makes diplomacy function effectively, and what makes a good leader a good leader. Well, I think the answer to your question, yes, it is. It already has. There was a meeting in Vienna, and that meeting in Vienna took place against the backdrop of extreme differences between Saudi Arabia and Iran. and 2 or 3 or 4 years of successful blocking of Iran attending those meetings by us and by others, out of a sense of responsibility to the views and attitudes of the Syrian opposition, which we were supporting, and in that regard to Saudi Arabia, perhaps Qatar, which were supporting the Syrian opposition. I think it was a feat of real diplomacy, and I think Secretary Kerry deserves real kudos for having, in fact, set up a meeting in which the Saudis and the Iranians were sitting at the same table and didn't, throw tomatoes at each other or whatever it was. And I think that's a step forward. My own view is that the Supreme Leader has said no bilateral meetings. On the other hand, I saw an interesting press report the other day of a bilateral meeting on the eve of Vienna, interestingly enough, between Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Zarif. No bilateral meetings, the Supreme Leader said, between the U.S. and Iran, except in the nuclear context. Well, maybe they meant in the nuclear context. I don't know. I don't know what they talked about. But it's important, I think, for us not to see the U.S. Iranian relationship as an entirely new paradigm in the Middle East, but as a contributing one to balance and stability and security in the Middle East, which ought to be our watchwords. We don't have a role picking hegemons. We should be out of the hegemon business. But we have a very strong sense of long-standing relationships in the Middle East. And they should in every way be buttressed and strengthened in their confidence that the United States will be with them, and that we support goals and openness and fairness and peace and stability in the Middle East. And our commitment with Iran is to fit them exactly into that paradigm, not to create some new unbalancing set of arrangements. And that will take time. It will take time with Israel. It'll take time with the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. But it is a part of American diplomacy to look ahead at the challenges of a place like the Middle East and the future role of Iran. And Iran undoubtedly has had strong advocates in its own system, if I could put it that way, for hegemonic ambitions. But that isn't on. And Iran will obviously try to carve out its own role. But that shouldn't be done by use of force. And if it is, we should be there, obviously, to support our allies and friends in preventing that kind of an approach. But at the same time, Iran can't hide from the United States and vice versa against this backdrop of 35 years of mistrust and misunderstanding. And still, we can expect that things in the Middle East will proceed in a manner which is in any way normal or reasonable. Each side has the opportunity, if I can call it that, across the Gulf to do each other damage. The worst thing in the world we could see is an active conflict. It would certainly have a real impact on oil. And while we have now some significant independence in oil, it would have a real impact on our friends and allies, to say nothing of the price. And so there are always ramifications, if I could put it that way, of instabilities in the Middle East that we should guard against. Of course, affected. We saw
In what
we
way?
had the Prime Minister of Israel speaking to the joint session of American Congress about his opposition to that, in his effort to, I think, misplaced, to enlist one party against the other, or had the effect of enlisting one party against the other on a particular arrangement. And in my view, I've been ambassador to Israel. Israel's long-term interests and security are best served by having a bipartisan support for the country and its security. But at the same time, I would think that just as Israel would take it amiss if President Obama appeared in the Israeli Knesset to oppose actions being taken by the Prime Minister of Israel, which he had a reasonable right to feel were in his own interest, but were proposed by the United States. I mean, should the president go and repay the visit and talk about settlements? We deeply oppose settlements. We've considered them in the past illegal, illegitimate, whatever you want to call it. And it is, in my view, an issue which stands in the way of real progress in peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And settlements in that sense, in my view, are not something that should be out of sight. After all, President Obama said peace in the Middle East and he meant Israel and Palestinians in the first place, was a vital interest of the United States. If it's a vital interest of the United States, how can we, in effect, subcontract our foreign policy to another country? We should have our own view. So that, I think, caused difficulties and problems. The Saudi issue was more subtle, but the Saudis made it very clear that they had deep concerns and uncertainties. And I hope the President, through the Camp David process, through the visit of King Salman, through what I think is now a strengthening relationship, find a way of finding more harmony. But finding a peace settlement in Yemen, and the Saudi foreign minister and the Iranian foreign minister both separately talked about the necessity, indeed the possibility. And I think the way the situation is moving there, there's an opening or an opportunity alongside Syria. So we have some openings here. And we talked about long-term challenges a minute ago. These are long-term challenges, but the opportunities in American diplomacy are to turn challenges into progress. And that's certainly what this administration seems to be trying to do there. It's got a lot of criticism for it. It won't be perfect for everybody, but look, we're a democracy. We should have that kind of back and forth. Sure. Since my time in Russia, I had an opportunity to have had conversations with him, and subsequently to have been involved in conversations with him, asking questions and things of that sort. I think that part of what we see today is an effort on the part of President Putin to do everything he can to reaffirm and strengthen his position of leadership in Russia. And I think that this follows a set of policies which are designed to do several things. One, take advantage of Russian feelings of nationalism, based in part on his own deep feelings, which he's not hesitated to express both publicly and I'm sure privately, that one way or another the United States, in his view, has been responsible. Would that we had all that power for color revolutions all around the world, which threaten Russia, for steps which have demeaned Russia, and he's given chapter and verse, and one of those I think is perhaps abandoning the ABM treaty, in which I would sympathize. And I mean, my views on this are not secret. I don't spend my life, however, sympathizing with foreign complaints about the United States, but I think this one has some justification to it. There are others that I think are overdrawn. I think that his reaction in some way has launched him down a path in which he's adopted several practices that I think he ought to re-examine if he wants to play a major role in the international community. And I think Russia's a big country. It has important aspects to its society and to its life that we shouldn't ignore, and that it should, in and of itself, be playing a major role. But when you say one thing and do something else, that leads the rest of the international community to wonder whether you're a reliable partner. And I think that there are real questions here. Is President Putin a reliable partner? He seems to believe, in fact, that perhaps based on his own long experience in the old KGB, this is a perfectly permissible way to proceed. Well, it may be among intelligence agencies, and it may be among propagandists, but I don't think it is among statesmen, and I think this is a difficult problem. You mentioned as well, and I see on the other side of the ledger with President Putin, that there does seem to be a serious and growing economic problem in Russia. Part of it perhaps for reasons of the failure over the years to use the considerable oil income he's realized to strengthen the diversity of his own economy, because Russia can do much more than produce oil and gas, and it has great capabilities, as we've seen. And the failure to strengthen those pieces of the economy has made the country more and more dependent upon oil and gas, much as it has been dependent in a plus-up sense. It is also dependent when it begins to lose markets. And so foreign exchange is declining, and we've seen things, foreign exchange holdings are declining. We've seen things like ruble devaluation in a very serious way, lack of foreign investment, capital flight, growing inflation, and things of that sort. And in my view, those are serious problems, and a leader of the quality of President Putin, in my view, should be paying more attention to it rather than trying to explain it away as not serious or will survive or we have all the capacity to do that. Maybe he does, but I think foreign exchange holdings went down from over $600 or $700 billion to close to 300 and still going south. And so one wonders, where that will take it. The more positive side is seemingly the shift away from Ukraine, with what I would call mission uncompleted. Parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts are in the hands of the separatists, but Minsk more or less seems to be holding up, not as it was before, say, 3 or 4 months ago. And now the new shift to Syria. And we're all concerned about the shift to Syria because it was an effort to try to use force, seemingly to give us the opportunity at the end of the day to have to choose between ISIS and Assad and no other party or no other player. And I don't think that is the way in which we want to go, nor do I think it's the way in which the Syrian people want to go. Is he in a quagmire or going to quagmire? I don't know. Some people seem to believe that. I don't think Syria inevitable produces quagmires. But the other interesting thing is, over the last 2 weeks, Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov, obviously with the support of their leaders, have now brought together the first meeting of a conference. It's supposed to meet again in 2 weeks. It's got a pretty good agenda. It's thought about some things to move on. And it's brought the principal players, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United States, Russia, UAE, and the Europeans, and many of the neighbors. And at some point, it'll have to have Syrians. At some point, they've talked about appointing or working on a Syrian government, a new Syrian government. At some point, they've talked also about spreading ceasefires. So this is a positive effort. And so if we can continue to find a way to avoid having our friends bombed out of existence by the Russians, and at the same time, concert our efforts in dealing with ISIS, and maybe work along the lines of what Henry Kissinger used to say, that, well, maybe we had to have Assad in at the beginning, but he ought to be out at the end. And there seems to be some growing potential consensus that in the long run, through some kind of electoral process, sometime in the future, the Syrian people ought to be given a fair opportunity to decide what they want. Well, then maybe that's a possibility. So we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Putin stood with us on Iran. We have a lot of cooperation on space. In the Arctic, we have some ups and downs, but I think no fundamentally horrible disagreements. And I think you can go around and pick and choose other places where things are working, and you can find other places where they aren't working. Well, part of the responsibility of big powers and world leaders is to work hard on the win-wins so they can encapsulate the relationship to the point where the lose-loses don't determine the end game.